Okay, so we're coming to the end of the MOS changes videos that I've been doing, and the only two factions we have left are Eriador and Mordor, and I will be covering Eriador in this video. So I will load in their roster once again, and we'll have a look at their units. Some of their units they've been given have actually been pretty good, honestly. I actually like some of the units that Eriador have been given, even if they're still not the strongest faction in the game, but they're pretty good. They're pretty good. So I'll load in their units and we'll take a look at them one by one. So, having a look at Eriador's units from here, it might look like they have a lot, and they do, kind of, although a lot of these units are actually repeated mercenary variants of their base units, which is, it just allows them to have more of one type of unit without the cost increasing. So, for example, you can have more battle-ready Dunedain because there is a mercenary variant of it. And it's the same with most units, like you have lumbermen as well, and a lumberman mercenary unit for reasons that I'm not quite sure of. But there are a couple of units within Eriador's foot contingent, which is now pretty vast when you include the mercenary units, that are pretty much completely new. One in particular, I think, is a very good addition to Eriador, and it does actually buff them pretty significantly, especially in MOS, where the defense is pretty high all around. Starting off with the Hobbitry and Arms. Now these guys, they're not particularly great, obviously low tier units. They're more survivable than they were, but they do basically no damage, and the discrepancy between the low tier units and the high tier units is so vast that it's not really very useful, especially when you can easily field your high tier units. So Hobbitry and Arms, not a brilliant unit overall. The Lumbermen, they do a decent amount of damage, but ultimately I would suggest that they're, too low tier. And also Eriador have got other units which are damaging, which are much more effective all round. The Lumberman's defense is still a little too low to make them worth it, although, they could be a good first wave in a siege to sort of make a decent gap with their damage on the walls, for example, and then you can send up your better stuff. But other than that, in a field battle, they're just a little bit too vulnerable to stuff like arrows and cav charges and the like. Bree Militia, while their base stats... Oh, that wasn't what I meant to do. While the Bree Militia's base stats have been buffed, so their defense is pretty decent now, so they will actually stand up to charges pretty well. Ultimately, the thing that brings them down a little bit really is the fact they've now not got Skiltron. So, they are still a low tier militia unit, and they have gotten worse in some ways and better in others, but ultimately not really worth it, especially when you look at the unit which is next to them, which is the Greenway Guards, which is a spear unit which is actually pretty good. They still can't form Skiltron, which is a real shame. But in terms of stats, they are pretty good. They're pretty much on a par with the Ravanian Gadrouts, a little bit better than the Moranon Guard, that sort of thing. In vanilla, the Greenway Guards would always make up the center of an Eriador army, and that is, it's not really completely true now, because with all the mercenary units and with some of the additional units, you're going to have a much more balanced army in terms of swords and shields and shock infantry. But the Greenway Guards are still a big part of Eriador. It's a good counteraction to enemy cavalry just running amok all over your lines. And, spears are always good. Nice and survivable. Good cost-effective way of defending against the enemy, which Eriador do need. Moving on then to the Merchant Militia. This was always an interesting unit because stats-wise they were always pretty good. But what let them down was their lower man count per unit, and this is still kind of the case. What am I saying? It's still kind of the case because they only have 102, which is low, especially when you put them next to something like Swan Knights, which has got 122. So the problem they have is still individually they're pretty good, but they just don't have the numbers to go toe to toe with many other units. It's not the end of the world because they are still pretty heavily armored. They still are a pretty good unit, and as Eriador you will likely be using them. But, they're still not going to do the business against some of the higher tier sword and shield units, which you'll find in the other factions. They're there just to provide a nice armoured part of your infantry to sort of pad out your line with a bit more survivability. And of course, Eriador's star attraction in terms of foot units was always the battle-ready Dunedain. They're called Dunedain swords in this one, of course. We've already been through that with Arnor. They are pretty good, though. They will be the main damage dealers in terms of your infantry. So I would say that they are still, in fact, even more so now, Eriador are going to be relying on these guys and their mercenary variant, which we'll get onto in a moment, But yeah, still a very cool looking unit as well. Very nice damage they deal. And now we got onto the mercenary units. Again, the lumberman mercenary, functionally identical to the lumberman. The bandits are back. The bandits are a very low tier sword and shield unit. They're basically on the same tier as the Bree militia, only they're a bit less survivable and they do a teeny bit more damage. You know, in vanilla they always had the problem that they were just, you know, they couldn't stand up to anything really. It was more of a case of, if you're in a very low funds game, you can maybe use these guys to overwhelm the enemy, but ultimately I had to say in MOS they're next to worthless because they don't deal enough damage and they're killed off too easily. Moving on then, this is the Merchant Militia. Mercenary means you can have more Merchant Militia if you so choose for less cost. Got a new type of camera and it's a little bit jittery. The Northern Line Volunteers. This is the unit which has been added to Eriador, which I think is most useful because it is a higher tier sword and shield unit than the Merchant Militia, and they have more in the unit. This is a mercenary unit technically, and it is one of a kind, so you're not going to be able to field quite as many as the Merchant Militia. But ultimately, the quality of these guys is worth it. They're not as heavily armoured as some of the swords and shield units you'll find in, for instance, Gondor or Arnor or Dale, but they are still a very, very nice addition to Eriador, and it gives them that extra utility. You know, Eriador's foot contingent was always their weakness, really. The fact that their infantry was never going to go toe-to-toe with really any faction other than maybe Rohan or Gundabad or the Misty Mountains, the lower tier factions. Now, though, with this, they can put up a more determined fight against some of the more focused foot infantry factions, or foot soldier factions, I should say. The battle-ready Dunedain Mercenary, again, functionally the same as the Dunedain swords, just means you can have more of them, and you will need more of them because that is the centre of your army. And then we have the archers, the Woodland hunters. You know, the archer nerfs affected them pretty badly. They're now very poor indeed. Not really going to get a lot of damage done downrange. The Hobbit Archers, well, the Banderbrass Archers and the Hobbit Archers. The Hobbit Archers only 1 missile damage, worthless basically. Banderbrass Archers, heavy nerf. They used to have pretty good missile damage, now they only have 2. So, again, I think the archer nerf is very schizophrenic across the board in terms of MOS. I'm not really sure what they were going for with it. Some units have taken not much of a nerf at all. These guys, next to worthless now. Very poor indeed. Archer Militia, again, very low tier unit. Not really worth it. Low tier archers in this mod do such poor damage. With your archers, you're going to want to be focusing down the enemy's better units, but there's no real point when your archers' arrows do no damage to them. So what you're really going to be wanting to use are the Dunedain Rangers, of course. Their missile damage is now 7, which is worse than it was, but it is still pretty high. It's still going to get some damage done. Eriador's archers were a good part of their faction in vanilla. They had a nice varied archer line, and most of their archers were pretty functional. Now there are less of them that are functional, must be said. Like, I would suggest that the Dunedain Rangers and the Elven Rangers, which we'll get onto in a moment, are the only ones that do enough damage to make them worth it. Other than that, though, a lot of Eriador's other archers are not worth it anymore. We have a Mercenary Woodland Hunters unit, which again, in terms of online balance, not really needed. And we have a mercenary version of the Rangers, the Ranger Volunteers, so this allows you to have more Dunedain Rangers, which you're going to desperately need as Eriador. And then we have the Elven Rangers. Individually, these guys are very, very good. They have 2 hit points, they do a lot of damage. The problem is there's only 20 of them, so ultimately you're not going to get too much done with them because there are just too few of them to make them worth it. So really, Eriador's infantry has been buffed slightly as a result of the mechanics changes and some of the new units, such as the Northern Line Volunteers and the ability to field more battle-ready Dunedain. But other than that, Eriador is still a relatively weak faction on foot. So now we will move on to their cavalry, so I will just get their cavalry onto the field. So this is likely to be a very short discussion indeed, because the cavalry has not really changed a great deal for Eriador. In fact, it has changed not at all, only in mechanics terms has it changed. Greenway sentries, of course, still a relatively low cost but pretty effective shock cavalry. You know, I would say that really you're going to be using the mounted battle ready Dunedain, but in a low funds game you might be using these, but again, multiplayer, balancing, kind of all over the place, so you're probably going to be able to afford the mounted battle ready Dunedain regardless of what you do. These guys, of course, pretty damned good. They do have less in the unit, even more so now, so they are maybe slightly less effective overall, but they're still very damaging and still form wedge. And the Dunedain bodyguards, of course. Bodyguards are, you know, I've voiced my opinion on bodyguards before in the past. Still the same here, no change. And the merchants, which are the only melee cavalry that Eriador have available. Melee cavalry not as effective as shock cavalry in the vast majority of situations, but they have their place. And the merchants are a pretty good melee cavalry, honestly, in terms of affordability and effectiveness. So that is Eriador's cavalry. Not a lot has changed, and Eriador's cavalry was always a pretty damn good part of their game. However, there is one very big absence in terms of Eriador, and it was the heart and soul of their faction, at least it was, the Grey Company. And without the Grey Company, Eriador really fall apart in terms of being an online faction that is feasible, because the Grey Company really were something that you could leverage against your opponent. They were by far and away the best horse archers in vanilla, and now they don't have them. And that means that Eriador have to rely on their melee cavalry and their infantry, because the archers, of course, have taken a bit of a nerf. Their Dunedain Rangers are still pretty effective. So ultimately, on reflection, I have to say that Eriador in multiplayer are one of the worst factions in MOS, simply because they've been defanged from vanilla pretty hard. So that's my opinions on Eriador, and next we will be looking at a faction which has been given a lot of new units, pretty much the star of the show, in Mordor. And in the next video I'll also be talking about what my next series will be. This series has really just been a small stopgap so that I was actually making videos in between the regular faction overviews and the next series. This has been just a little overview of all of the new things about the factions, and I'd like to make my videos a little better. These have been very basic, but I haven't really been able to think of anything new that I'm able to do up until now, of course, because now Reforged is coming out. I do have some ideas of what I can do to make the videos a little bit better, and I'll go into more detail on that in the next video when we take a look at Mordor.